Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final day of facilitating SRAE with excellence. My name is Julie Marchbanks from Public Strategies, and I will be the host for today. Before we get started, I want to review a couple of housekeeping items with you and explain how you can participate in today's Zoom session. We invite you to use the chat box to ask a question, make a comment, or to address any technical issues. Please be sure to select the drop-down Everyone so that the moderator can read your question out loud. If you do not see the chat box located in the panels on your screen, please select the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. The controls will auto-hide, so you may have to mouse over the bottom of your screen to display your meeting control toolbar. The polling feature will be used during today's session. You will be prompted to answer the polls. If you do not see the polls, you will need to enable pop-ups in your application settings or change your Zoom video layout. Video layout options are located in the top right corner of your screen. This presentation will be recorded. Recordings, presentations, and handouts will be available on the Exchange about 1 week after the topical training has concluded. At this time, I would like to welcome our moderator, Mary Ann Mozak, President and CEO of Ascend.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to day 3. Can you believe it? Here we are. This is an exciting topic, and so you are in track 1, and the title of this session is Applying the Optimal Health Model Among Trauma-Sensitive Youth in SRAE Programs. And our presenters today are Dr. Lynette Tanis, who is the author of Educating Incarcerated Youth. And Dr. Tanis is on the faculty of Harvard University, where she teaches a course that she herself has designed. Also joining her is Dr. Connie Huber, and she is currently a project manager with Public Strategies. She's a former SRAE program director and an Ascend trainer. She holds a master's in public health and a doctorate in education leadership. So fasten your seatbelts, everyone. I think you're going to get so much great information from this session. Ladies?
All right, the goals of today's program are to have a better understanding of the needs and the strengths of trauma-sensitive youth, and to be mindful of such participants and to provide authentic and mindful, effective teaching strategies. So our goal is really to increase the awareness of effective SRAE health models and teaching practices for trauma-sensitive youth.
Good afternoon, everyone. And so in addition to the goal, we do have 3 learning objectives that we hope you'll be able to meet by the end of our time together. And one is that you'll be able to explain some of the needs of trauma-sensitive youth, that you'll be able to assess effective teaching practices when working with trauma-sensitive youth. And lastly, that you will actually be able to work effectively with this population to increase positive behavioral outcomes. And so this first question that we have here, we want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding for the word trauma. And so first, it's just important for us to kind of recognize this could be, you know, a car accident that has occurred. It could be someone who's experienced divorce, death of a loved one. It could be a rape, for example. Just even with all that's going on, unrest, pandemic, natural disasters, all of those situations could also lead to trauma. And it just depends on how these traumas may be impacting your students. In terms of the definition that comes from the Center for Treatment of Anxiety and Mood Disorders, trauma is a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. So now that we kind of understand or have sort of a shared understanding in terms of what is trauma, just kind of thinking about how this may manifest in children with some of the learners that you work with, it's just important to kind of see how or what this may appear. So from the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children, with grief, sadness is obvious. But with trauma, as you can imagine, the symptoms can go largely unrecognized because it actually shows up looking like other problems. So it may be a child who is exhibiting frustration or acting out, has a difficult time concentrating or following directions or working in a group. And according to the Institute, for children who have experienced trauma, learning can be a huge struggle. It's really important for you, for us who work with trauma-sensitive youth, when we see these types of behaviors manifested, that we kind of shift our thinking. Maybe not everyone's thinking needs to be shifted. Maybe this is just naturally how you would approach it, but you actually begin to ask, I wonder what's going on with this youth versus what's wrong with this youth.
And Lynette, before we go a little bit deeper and talk about different types of trauma, I believe we had a poll question that we were going to ask the audience. So if we bring that poll up now.
Awesome.
Have the nation's recent current events led you to think more about the trauma that your students may be experiencing?
We've got quite a few people still answering the poll, so we'll give you about another 20 seconds.
Lynette, this is just about what we expected with the current events and things that are happening. It looks like folks are more aware now than maybe ever before. And so this is very timely to be talking about this, because this is something that probably, as we look at, as we continue, may be something that more students are experiencing and may be more timely to be looking at. All right, so we're going to move forward and talk about complex trauma. And now that we have a shared understanding about trauma and how it may manifest itself, let's look at some definitions as we explore different types of trauma. Complex trauma is a type of trauma that occurs repeatedly and cumulatively, usually over a period of time with specific relationships and context. Complex trauma might also be referred to as child traumatic stress. Children who suffer from traumatic stress are those who have been exposed to one or more traumas over the course of their lives and develop reactions that persist in their daily lives even after those events have ended. Without treatment, repeated childhood exposure to traumatic events can eventually impact the brain, the nervous system, and lead to increased risky behaviors and health-risking behaviors.
And Connie, here are, some examples, as we've talked about in preparing this, of complex trauma or child traumatic stress. Some of you may be familiar, or maybe many of you may be familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, and also known as ACEs. And, with this, it's just so you have an idea, children who experience anywhere from 4 to 7 of these events, they are considered those who are impacted by complex trauma. So again, just making sure that we understand that this is happening to some of our children, and the nature or the types of trauma that they may be impacted by. Each of you have a handout or have access to a handout that is referred to as PACEs. This is sort of a recent research over the last couple of years that kind of looks at, well, what are those sort of positive and compensatory experiences that children experience? So kind of looking at it from a positive side. So, do they have a loved one, someone who they believe just loves them unconditionally? And there's a checklist there. And so there are different ways that you can kind of look at it, both using the tool, the ACEs tool. That this might not be something that you yourself may do, but some of the organizations who serve the same students that you serve might be using tools like this. So it's good to at least be familiar with the terminology and have an understanding. And then also to kind of see with those sort of those positive attributes to ensure that children are on a sort of positive trajectory, having hopefully lessened the amount of traumatic experiences. The PACES guide that you have would also be a great tool for you to refer to.
Lynette, there is a question.
Oh, great.
Stephen would like to know, does a father being violently, treated, does that count as an example of trauma? According to the chart, it's just mother here.
So in terms of the actual research, in terms of what may be the greater impact, whether it's father or mother, I'm not exactly sure what the research is for that, but overall, typically the term is like actually experiencing violence within the home. Is what definitely leads to those traumatic experiences.
Thank you.
There was actually, I'll just share the 74 million. It's just an organization that comes out with a newsletter, and just recently had a story this week of a girl, an 18-year-old. They did not provide any specific statistics about her or any personal information about her, just for her own protection. But she just shared how, on the outside, things seem to be very positive in her home. Her father is a retired police officer. Her mother, appears to be kind. Like, you would think that everything is fine, but she just recalled a lot of sort of trauma and abuse that she experienced from her dad at a young age. And, she's just kind of reckoning with that as she's getting older. So it would be interesting to kind of see what the data does show with that. But I imagine, just based on what I've experienced with youth, although this is what is there in place for ACEs, that would be a very traumatic experience as well. Thank you for that question. All right, so just want to provide you with just a couple of, and we'll even just throughout our time together, just be talking about various strategies and such, again, with working with this population, with teaching and supporting this population. But one thing, again, this comes out of the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children. Typically, children who are going through or, are trauma sensitive, they are worrying about what's going to happen next. So that is a constant worry for them. They do need to feel that they're good at something and they can influence the world. So even in thinking about, Maslow's hierarchy, although that was work done by Abraham Maslow in the early 1940s, just our need as human beings to feel like we are making a contribution, that, again, that we can sort of self-actualize and see our purpose. Going back to the trauma-sensitive youth, self-regulation can be a major challenge. Again, some of the coping strategies that these children have learned is actually for their own protection, because they have, in some cases, been abused or have encountered experiences that kind of, they put their walls and their guards up. So just keep that in mind. And then, just also, you don't need to know what caused the trauma to be able to help. So don't feel like, well, I don't know their story. I just see her acting out. You don't need to dig deep necessarily to know what it is, but be able to recognize those signs and, again, to be mindful. Hopefully today you'll get some strategies that will be helpful, but then being able to talk to others within the environment who can also provide some strategies as well. And so this kind of just leads us to this next, it's really, it's a resource, but also just we want to bring this to your attention. So there's this book called Bandwidth Recovery. And especially now with COVID-19 and just the significant increase of bandwidth that we as a nation, but even throughout the world, have been relying on. So imagine this may have even happened in some of your own meetings or sessions where people are cutting in and out, like the bandwidth is just so low. So the way that this author really equates children who have experienced trauma, again, children who may be from poverty, just a lack of shelter, and just other events that have occurred, it's a depletion of their bandwidth, so to speak. And so in the same way, if the bandwidth in your home or in your office has been depleted, you got to like clean out, you got to cut out some of these tabs that are on your screen. You know, you got to like troubleshoot in a way. And so it's the same way, is that when children are experiencing these traumatic events, a part of their brain, and this is what the brain research shows as well, it's like spaces are being taken up where normally that would be for learning. The trauma is actually depleting their bandwidth. So again, just something else to think about with this population.
I think that's a great thing to think about. I think we're talking about complex trauma and we're talking about chronic stress, but I think in this current environment that we're in, we should think a little bit about acute stress. I recall Marianne very frequently talking about advantage discrimination, and you know, there are students that have had an advantage up to this point, particularly like academic achievement and success in school, that maybe are not experiencing that type of advantage academically now that they're doing that in a virtual environment. And so some of those that previously as students we wouldn't have thought were under stress, now that they're working in an online environment that maybe they're not comfortable with, or proper resources at home aren't available for success in that area. So we need to be aware not just of chronic stress, but acute stress that can occur as youth are facing new challenges and working through that, as are parents, you know, trying to deal with that. So thinking about acute stress at this time too. Mm. So now let's look at some effective practices with working with trauma-sensitive youth. So juvenile delinquency. Delinquent girls have higher rates of trauma experiences and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Experiential measures of trauma are significant predictors of delinquency and involvement in health-risking behaviors. So as we talk about that, we'd like to take a poll. We've already talked about what's happening in 2020. And so let's take a look at, prior to 2020, approximately what percentage of the students you served were experiencing some form of trauma. So if we could bring up that poll, let's just think about this, that high rates of trauma really have an impact on high risk. So prior to 2020, what percentage of students you served were experiencing some form of trauma? And then the next question is, with all the events of 2020, approximately what percentage of students you served are experiencing some form of trauma now?
As a reminder, please scroll down in your poll box to reveal all the selections for question 2 if they're not visible on your screen. And we'll give everyone approximately 20 more seconds to complete the poll.
Wow, this is pretty significant. I know we haven't revealed the results yet, but seeing the percentages so far, wow.
The results have been posted.
It's very telling. Again, understanding that as at least about 20% of you are kind of like, well, I'm not really sure, you know, in sort of both cases, but I think what stands out to me is, you know, sort of this up to 75% before is at the 30% level, and up to 75% is at 19%, and then that 75 to 100% is at 13% sort of pre-2020, and then 39% now as it's being experienced.
Lynette, it would probably be interesting also to see as educators get back into interfacing what that looks like, because the summer and being disconnected a bit. So it's very interesting that it's still that high.
Yeah, very true. Thanks, Marianne.
That's a good point, because I wonder if some are still implementing virtually, if that's as easy to gauge in that environment as it might be in the face-to-face environment too. So as folks are saying they don't know, maybe it's not even so much lack of access, but like just being able to read those cues that you would see in that virtual environment. So that definitely changes things. So Lynette, if we look at like juvenile delinquency that we were talking about, that measures of trauma are significant predictors for delinquency and involvement in health risking behaviors. We see that as that stress and trauma goes up, that risk behaviors are impacted as well. So the largest percentage of trauma-sensitive youth are likely to be found in juvenile detention or residential facilities. And so if we take a look at those numbers, and these came from a longitudinal study from the youth in the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, 96% had at least one trauma. 84% had experienced more than one trauma, and 57% were exposed to trauma 6 or more times. Now, Lynette, you've spent quite a bit of time supporting states and juvenile justice educators, and I believe you actually spent some time with educators and youth at the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
It seems that we know practices that help the most marginalized and most traumatized youth. We can work effectively with all youth. So I'd love it if you'd share some of your experiences and strategies with us about working with those youth.
Sure. Thanks, Connie. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think before I jump into sort of my research and specific examples from lessons that I taught in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, just want to highlight a couple of strategies that is shared from the Complex Trauma Treatment Network for, again, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And so effective strategies, one, a very important one, and this is also what I'll talk about in my research and work, is taking time to build trust. Many often, the barriers for trust have been broken. And so being able to get to know your students, being even just confident and clear about who you are and why you're there, so that they do see that you're there to help as a help, not to harm. Strive to make every interaction with youth honest and respectful. And so, there might be things within your own self. Maybe you have also been impacted by traumatic experiences. It's important that you kind of get a check for yourself of are there certain things that may trigger you? And just kind of even thinking about social emotional learning components, being able for us, we, the adults, need to help make sure we manage effectively our emotions so that we can then mirror those same healthy behaviors for our learners. So keeping that in mind. Just being open to alternative ways of understanding the youth's motivations that highlight their core values, goals, and competencies. And then if or when conflict or disagreements occur, just being emotionally regulated and respectful. That's just a really important piece. And then remember that there's no one size fits all strategy. Every individual needs to be known and understood as the person he or she is capable of being. And I think this was touched upon even in our curriculum session yesterday, just the importance of us getting to know the learners and being able to provide the varying scaffolding within the lessons to meet all of the needs for learners.
Lynette, some great comments are coming in that it looks like some scaffolding may be needed for the educational tools and to deal with, unemployment issues because of COVID. So when you say one size doesn't fit all, that's for sure, but a number of people have been experiencing that with their youth, trauma related to COVID.
Yeah, I think, Miriam, what comes to mind for me is I think, I think it's important that we are at least aware of, that we make ourselves aware of resources that are out there and available. We don't have to be the tree necessarily that provides all of the fruit or, shade for people who may need that. But just being aware so that we can serve as a resource for this population, and not even just for the youth, but even for the adults who are also supporting them in other ways, the organizations or schools. I think that also further strengthens the bonds and the relationships if we're able to say, oh, I'm not sure if you're aware, but this organization, just started and they're providing these extra supports, especially during COVID-19. So I think for sure, keeping those things in mind of how we can serve as a resource. We don't have to be the person, but be able to at least, share this wealth of resources that are available, I think will help with that.
Excellent.
And so I'm just going to move in now to, so this is sort of my research and work. I actually in 2009, when I started working on my doctorate, actually entered the doctoral program being trained to be a school superintendent. I had helped turn around schools as a literacy coordinator, as a school principal, and I thought my research would be about effective school leadership or something along those lines. But it was actually in July of 2009 that I started researching and just sort of had the question, what does education look like for incarcerated youth? And I couldn't believe that there was not a lot of research out there. And the teacher and school leader in me also realized there were not a lot of resources and support even for the adults who are responsible for providing the resources and education for these youth. And so as Connie shared, it's also my belief, if we can figure out what's needed with our most marginalized population, imagine what that means for all children and what we're able to do. And so a couple of things I'll just share with you just in terms of the research, and then also how I applied this in some facilities, including in the one example that was shared with Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. So the facilities, I spent time in Florida actually for this, and just observing the classes, interviewing the teachers and principals, and these four themes emerged: the importance of relationships, expectations, resources, and accountability. And in the facilities where relationships were strong, the adults knew children by name. There was one teacher who even sprayed the classroom with potpourri before the children entered to kind of give them this sense of yeah, you're valued. We all should have a nicely smelling room. So that's just one thing. Resources, accountability. I'll just give you kind of two examples just to kind of show the difference. So in one facility where the relationships were not strong, people didn't know the youth by name. The staff actually changed every 2 years, so they were hard to sort of build those relationships. One of the expectations was well, if a kid has his head down, we don't bother him because he may cuss you out, which may be true, but not necessarily the right way to approach it. Resources were sort of varied, and accountability, there really wasn't any accountability. People, even the special education teacher, didn't have a schedule. And she told me, if a child needs me 1 hour or all day, I'm there for that child. And it's okay, great for that child, but what about the other 79 children who have an individualized education program? So there's that example. In that facility, even with only 5 students in a class, 2 had their heads down, 2 were attentive, and 1 was kind of singing, rapping, doing his own thing. And there was an average disruption, 1 disruption occurring every 52.50 seconds. And the youth were actually brought to class 14 minutes late. So they were missing out on 20% of their instruction each day. So I just want to give you another example to contrast with a similar facility. These youth were there between 6 to 9 months, but the relationships were so strong. Even the special education teacher, he would greet the students as they came to the door. Good morning, Mrs. Such. He would give them a fist pound. So he knew them by name. The facility side and the education side came together to meet about the students, even if it was non-educational issues. one of the clear expectations posted was heads up at all times. Imagine that. They had ample resources for the students and for the education staff, and accountability was in place. Everyone had a schedule, including the special education teachers. So people could be held accountable in terms of where they needed to be. And the students, there also was a behavior incentive program in place to support their behaviors, which kind of gave a point system and then was able to reward those youth. In that facility, there were up to 19 students in a class and up to 19 students on task. Like, you would have thought you were just in a traditional high school, which was really awesome to experience. The youth were still brought to class late. They were brought to class on average of 8 minutes. So they, an average of 5 minutes. So they were missing out on 8% of their instruction time. I have yet to be in a facility where everyone is brought to class on time. So just also something to think about. But there was an average of 1 disruption occurring every 2 minutes and 50 seconds. So it's kind of like, yes, in this environment, there may be disruptions, but they can definitely be minimalized. So definitely when it comes to the relationships piece, that is just something I just want to stress to you all, being able to build those relationships. So that's the research behind, but let me give you some concrete examples. So part of the work that I do is, yes, supporting state leaders, again, around like juvenile justice education policies, and just supporting school leaders in traditional and in carceral spaces as well. And so part of it is kind of like, I'm doing these professional development sessions of like how we need to engage learners. But then it's like, but Lynette, like, but do you know our kids? Like, yeah, I do, and so I'll come in and do a demonstration lesson, and of course that's the true test of like, am I really a teacher? But I would just share with you, every time that this has happened, it's always been just so much positive things that come out of that. And here's why. One, in a very short time, so even in a 45-minute lesson, I try my best to build relationships. How do I do that? Even just walking into that room and making eye contact. I'm a smiler. That's just me. Like, so I'm just kind of giving the smile, the head nod. There are ways in which that don't take much time or energy necessarily. For me, I'm speaking, but you can at least connect. So you provide sort of this warmth there. And then being very clear about my expectations. So, because, I'm going from room to room, actually just having my expectations just on a sheet of paper so that they can see in marker, but like, we're going to be respectful, heads up at all times, and so being very clear about those expectations, that then helps ensure that, like, one, I'm starting to build these relationships. I give them the brief 2 minutes about me, and then what the expectation is. And then in terms of like resources, being able to teach the lesson is important, and making sure that you have the appropriate resources. So knowing in advance, Connie mentioned this yesterday in the curriculum session about, having additional note cards or, other things that the staff, that participants shared as well, kind of thinking in advance. Here's the task that I want them to do. Where might they struggle, right? We're not mind readers. Maybe some of you are. I'm not. But thinking in advance of like where they might struggle and being able to provide some of those resources, but then seeing yourself as a resource. So being able to, once you start the lesson, circulating the room, see who might be struggling, maybe even giving them some opportunities, different ways that they can demonstrate mastery of the content. That's also been helpful. So I think about a child, we were working on the Fibonacci sequence. This was a math lesson. And a child, he was just like, I'm stupid, And so I just leaned down, I just kneeled down next to him, and I was like, what? Like, why? Why would you say that? He's like, I don't get it. And I was like, okay, you might not get it, but that doesn't mean you're stupid. So like, let's go back. And so he actually went through the first couple of sequences. So I'm like, of course, then sharing that like legit excitement and giving him that feedback of like, okay, if something was wrong with you, I doubt you'd even be able to understand one sequence, you know? And his face lit up a little bit and he actually was able to complete the task. The accountability piece is really like holding them accountable. So thinking about how they can share at the end, you know, the expectation is you're going to share either with your small group or with the large class, like one takeaway from today, either the project that you worked on or something that you learned or you're going to really focus on from now as a result of the lesson. And so after those lessons, I always debrief with the teachers. They're in the room there with the school leaders as well. And I just always ask the question like, okay, this is your classroom. Like, what did you notice with this group? Did you see the same level of participation? And sometimes it's like, yeah, no. Most times it's like, no, because Jalen usually has his head down and Marcus is usually walking around. And it's like, okay, so what did you notice was different? And each time they talk about the way, my mannerisms, again, building those relationships, the choice that's been given to them and being clear about those expectations. And so again, this is not all the pieces you'll get sort of in the hour time that we have with you, but my hope is that you at least have something additional to further enhance your toolkit in working with this population.
Lynette, I think you've brought up a great point here that in SRA we talk about quite frequently, and I've heard this said numerous times, is that the expectation is here, and I'm never going to lower the expectation, but I'm going to bring you up to meet the expectation. And like what we were talking about yesterday with scaffolding, how are we going to build this scaffolding to get you up to this expectation? So great information there that's very relevant to SRA programming. Thank you for that.
Awesome. Of course. Thank you, Connie. So the next thing that we just want to do is just actually share this poem with you, just to, again, this is from one learner who was in a facility. There's an annual poetry contest that is held. The Center for Educational Excellence in Alternative Settings facilitates this for all incarcerated youth to write a poem. They actually provide the curriculum for teachers on that. So it's definitely something worth checking out. And so this is a girl who writes, "What I know for sure is that my mother loves me, but her addiction might be forever. What I know for sure is the sun will come up tomorrow. People will die and life will keep moving on. I know that life is hard sometimes, and some days I won't want to get up. A child of an addict craving my mother's love, it makes my heart sick. What I know for sure is I made a little girl of my own. I know I don't want to cause the same pain I felt to my daughter in her life. What I know for sure is I love my daughter with my whole heart. Running away will never work. A mother cannot run away. It only causes more pain. I also know forgiving my mother and then myself might take a long time, but in the end, I need to remember my mother did, still does, and always will love me. Now that I've grown up a lot, I've come to realize that I want to love my mother from a distance. I know that I can show my daughter that I love her in a different way. What I know for sure is I will break the cycle of drug addiction. My mother loves me, and because of me, her addiction won't be forever, and the sun will come up tomorrow. I know if I break the cycle, then through me, her addiction won't last forever." And so we just wanted to share this with you, one, because even though we're talking about trauma-sensitive youth, it's important that we not approach this as if it's a crippling or this, oh, we need to be apathetic or anything like that. Yes, we need to definitely demonstrate empathy, but these children are children, they're human beings, they are brilliant people, and it's really important that we find ways to tap into their brilliance and clearly their resilience as well.
Lynette,
Thank you so much for your
a comment that you might enjoy at this juncture is Gregory shared that he doesn't treat the students as projects that need to be fixed.
Awesome.
Thank you for sharing that, Marianne. That's very powerful. And these insights that you've shared, Lynette, we could tie them back to things that have happened throughout this week where we heard in behavior predictors about self-efficacy, you know, not lowering the expectation, but increasing the self-efficacy. We've also talked about scaffolding. So you can see how these presentations are, you know, weaving in concepts that can definitely be used. And so for the last component of our session, we're going to talk about how can SRAE serve as an optimal model for trauma-sensitive youth.
So Connie, as you know that, you know, trauma-sensitive youth, I mean, even just thinking about the poem, it has been linked to risky sexual behaviors. And I know that you've been working with this population for quite some time and supporting them. So I think it would be great to hear like some specific examples, especially with the SRAE curricula and others, in terms of what approaches you found to be most effective.
Thank you, Lynette. And in SRAE, we use the optimal health approach. And when applying the optimal health approach to implementation, learning experiences should increase motivation. So if we take a look at the definition for the optimal health model, as we've also heard shared this week, is the optimal health model is a dynamic balance of physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and intellectual health. Lifestyle change can be facilitated through a combination of learning experiences that enhance awareness and increase motivation, and that's a key point, increasing motivation. Building skills, most important through the creation of opportunity, providing those opportunities that you talked about, Lynette, that open access to environments that make positive health practices the easiest choice. And so as you previously stated, we really want to have a hope-informed approach that underscores the value that all youth have, no matter what their past experiences are, no matter what their current situation is. And so the shift to PACES that focuses on positive experiences can help reduce risk, increase resiliency, and instill hope. So not only do we want to be trauma-informed, but we want to be hope-informed, where we're really instilling hope in youth when maybe they don't feel much of that, just as we saw in the poem of the hope that the young person had that things might be different. And with current events, I think hope is so important right now as folks are facing challenges in a more broad spectrum than we've maybe seen previously. So we'll take a look at some lessons learned. SRAE is an effective model that addresses all dimensions of health and can help with tremendous gains in ensuring that this approach is trauma sensitive. So I kind of want to take a step back to the past, and let's take a look at an older demo that maybe some of you are familiar with that was kind of popular, the Rose demo. And so with the Rose demo, a facilitator would do a very visual, some folks are visual, a very visual demonstration of how consequences could have an impact on the future. But unfortunately, the demo had unintended consequences that really no one ever wanted to bring into the class. But as we talk about being hope-informed, how are we adding hope? And so here's this demo, if you're not familiar with it, is the facilitator would bring in 2 roses and a volunteer would be asked to come to the front, and they would be given a rose, and the participant, as the facilitator, read a scenario that talked about engaging in sexual activity and risk behaviors. The youth would be asked, the participant, to pull off petals for each one of those experiences that they would encounter. And as the story would go on, the young person would be left holding just a rose stem. And then the facilitator would say, this is what consequences can do of risky behaviors? And someday in the future, which rose do you want to offer to your future spouse? Lynette, I'll never forget the day, wow, when a young girl stood holding this and said, Mrs. Huber, everybody knows that a rose doesn't grow its petals back. And she said, now what? My heart just ached. Imagine that young girl standing there feeling like she had nothing to offer. Ouch. That was an unintended consequences. It made a huge impact, but unintended consequences. Never was the thought to strip value or to take away hope and hope to be lost. All that SRAE programs wanted to do was to motivate youth and make change and create change in substantive behaviors and move away from risk and maintain risk avoidance status. But sometimes in our efforts to create an emotional picture or visual picture to the youth, sometimes we don't look at those unintended consequences. But as my good friend says, when you know better, you do better. And so the movement away from those types of things where we're really examining things like that, new approaches have emerged that not only are informed about trauma and looking at triggers, but I think more now than ever, we should be thinking about hope informed. Not just are we not doing damage, but looking at are we adding hope and choosing those things which really add hope. And so I'd love to share this demo with you, and it is with a $100 bill. And so the facilitator would show up in the classroom with a $100 bill, and it's nice and crisp. And so the $100 bill, you would ask the youth, how many of you would like to have this? And you can answer in the chat box. How many of you would like to have this $100 bill? And what do you think the youth might say? How about you? Would you like this $100 bill? Yes. And you can think about what are all the things that you would do with this if this represented your life? What are all the things that you would want to accomplish or buy or do? And I'm seeing all this. Of course, send this cash to me, people are saying. Okay, so folks can think of all the things they would want in the future with this. And so why do you want this? Somebody answer in the chat box. Why do you want this? Lynette, why would you want this?
Well, I'd definitely be able to buy some things with that.
It has value. So this has value. And so the facilitator would give this to the participant, and the participant would be asked to crumple it all up, crumple it up, put it on the floor, stomp on it, okay, smear it around a little bit, might get a little bit, damaged. So that can represent the consequences. Yes, there will be damage and consequences of risk behavior. Okay, and so does the bill look like it did? No, it's kind of damaged from the things it's experienced. But how many of you would still want this? So go ahead and answer in the chat box, who still wants this?
Yeah, there are lots of yeses, Connie. There are capital yeses.
So yes, why do you still want it? I love it. Pick me. Why would you still want this? Because the value is retained. Just because it's gone through some experiences and has had some damage, it still has value. And so the value is retained and hope is added because the young person that walks away with this, even though it has damage, it still has value and can still accomplish those things that the future holds. So.
Awesome. Connie, that's such an awesome example. And I think it just also echoes, what we've been saying in the importance of us demonstrating value to our learners or students or participants, and how, yeah, I mean, that's very telling.
And I
think the point, one of the points we would try to make is it's not just enough to look at it and see if it's going to induce trauma, but to look, does it add hope and does it leave that young person feeling like the hope and value are in place? So.
Awesome. Marianne, there was something you were going to say.
Well, I'm just so impressed with the term hope informed. We've talked about trauma informed, but let's pair it with hope informed, as we're interfacing with these students.
Yeah.
Everybody needs hope, right?
Definitely. Yes.
There's another great demo in the chat box. I can just see that forming. Julie says, broken crayons still color. And so there's so many ways that we can really keep that value and add hope. So let's go out and think about how we can create demos that aren't just trauma informed, but actually add hope and add value. And I love that. That's great.
Awesome. Well, we have about 10 minutes or just under 11 minutes that we just want to open up this time now for any questions you might have, or just even any comments. If there's something that you have done with your participants or learners that you found to be effective in working with trauma-sensitive youth, or please feel free to type that in the chat, or you can also, perhaps Marianne, maybe they can unmute themselves and just ask a question if they would like.
That'd be great.
Julie, is that possible for them to unmute?
Yes, or if we want to announce somebody's name, River can unmute them.
Oh, perfect. So if you'd like to speak, just please feel free to put that in the chat and River will unmute you. And or you can please feel free to type your questions directly in the chat box.
I was very, as people are thinking, and I'm sure they're thinking, because this has been very excellent information, I've been very taken with the fact, and you mentioned it today, that trauma-sensitive youth need a plan. Even if it's a plan for like an hour, it helps them. Do you want to comment on that? I talked about it in another session in the context of goal setting.
Connie, do you want to jump in there, or do you want me to respond?
I would just make this statement that, like, we know that the brain activity and the brain science tells us that just having that routine and having a plan and knowing what's expected really calms down the nervous system and the centers of the brain that make it difficult to think, that brain energy that's spent elsewhere that's not focused on learning. So that would be the contribution I would make.
So I would then just add to that. I think planning solidifies purpose, and so it's without a plan, it's almost like there's a lack of purpose. And going again, just kind of directly tying that back to Maslow's hierarchy, that middle rung is like have a sense of belonging, like we do have a sense of purpose. And so even if it is a simplistic plan, that demonstrates that there's some purpose for my life today or this moment. And so I think there's definite power behind that, and for us encouraging our learners to be planners.
Being very intentional about the message that we want to send, again, not just examining that to see if it's going to be triggering, but examining it to see if it is going to add hope and add to the sense of hope and add to the sense of value. Being very intentional about those messages. I love what someone put in the chat box about amazing, or I'm trying to combine two there, using positive affirmations and just always using things that create a positive and create that sense of worth and value, and planning to do that, and building that into the plan, as well as teaching the youth to plan and to order their time and to order their day.
River, do you see that Peggy Cowan would like to speak?
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Am I? Thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
I just want to say to Lynette and Connie, thank you so much for this information. It is incredibly important, the difference that we can make in a young person's lives, especially if we're intentional. A quick little story. When my kids were growing up, I was the volunteer on Thursday mornings in the library, and I was partnered with another mom. And that mom, over the weeks, shared her story with me. And she had this most incredibly traumatic background of her mom being on drugs. Her father was never in the picture. She lived with her grandmother, but grandma worked all the time. And this woman was a wonderful mother. She had a stable marriage. Her two little boys were incredible. And I said, how did that happen? I know where you came from and look where you are. And she said, after school, before my grandmother would come home late at night, I would go to a neighbor's house and I would become part of their family for a little while. And she said, I determined then as a child in late grammar school that that's who I want to be. And that's who she was. And it was just the influence of one important person in her life showing her exactly what you're talking about. She had value, she could attain the things that she was looking for. So thank you for your encouragement to all of us to keep making a difference.
Awesome. Thanks, Peggy. Great seeing you. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think of the term, I feel like most recently people are tending to use is chosen family. We may have our biological family or, our adoptive family, but, there's some people that we choose to be as sort of family to us and the importance of having those supports. There's a question that came up actually in the chat that just asked about, how do we sustain the relationships or retain the relationships that we start to build with juveniles, particularly if they are perhaps in a facility or at a site, if they're only there for a short time. I would just say, especially in detention centers or residential facilities, there's just even policy usually that teachers and even program staff are not allowed to contact the youth beyond their time there. So when they are reunited back to their families or to their home communities, there is no additional communication that happens. These are actually safety mechanisms that have been put in place to protect the vulnerable population. So in many cases, don't feel like there's a difference for you. I would just strongly suggest that even if you don't know the amount of time that you have, what we remember most is how someone impacts us in that moment or for those times. And so whether it is one session or 3 sessions, maybe nothing beyond that, just really focus on providing the best experience that you can for those participants, and just trust that, things will work out. So.
I see there's a question in the chat box that brings up adaptations and how to respond to that in the classroom. And I also saw that we're getting the time warning. So in response to that question that's there, with public strategies, you have the ability with your project officer to talk about individualized TA, and that's definitely something that we would love to assist you with when you talk about adaptations and responding to those situations that happen, and actually having a process for your team to respond to different situations that happen in the classroom. So that might be something that you would choose to seek out as individual TA with the team at Public Strategies to work through those types of things with your program. So.
There's one question that just stood out to me from Douglas. How do you personally go about planning in a manner that allows you to prepare for occurrences, but still remain the fluidity of adaptation? I think, being able to, as you're preparing for what it is, having that direct contact with the organization who hopefully knows the youth more than you, but that might not be the case. You can share with them what you're planning for the lesson and just ask, with this group of 6th graders or with this group of 9th graders, whatever it is, do you believe it might cause a trigger, that this topic may be a trigger for any of the participants? So at least, you can be aware of that in advance. But again, that really does go back to the partnership and relationship building. It's really important that you build those relationships so then people feel comfortable to trust you with that information.
and in schools in particular, having, if there's a guidance counselor or someone on staff that deals with those issues, just building those partnerships within the school to see what their protocol are. Some places have specific protocols that they follow, and I think that's great advice. You talk to the gatekeeper at the school, the person that would handle those situations, having resources, community partnerships. I think right now more than ever, community partnerships are so important, and having those things on ready so that you know how to respond to that and already have a plan in place. You may not be able to handle it within the context of the classroom in that moment, but having those resources available so you do have an immediate response to that.
Yeah, and then just this next one, I see, and Christina's probably referring to a comment that Rod made in the chat, but I just see hers, just thinking about not feeling like there's enough time to build relationships. Like, we got to get to this curriculum, we got to get to this lesson. I just want to caution you. I mean, you know, just practice your 1 to 2 minute pitch that just at least provides a window into who you are as a person, why you are there. Hopefully there's some kind of care that comes from you, because what just comes to mind is this quote: a person, or in this case, a child, could care less how much you know until they know how much you care. And so don't fall into the trap of like, okay, we only have 45 minutes, I got to get started. They will look at you. Some may, just because they know that they're going to get in trouble, they might sit there and they may appear compliant. But if you really want to get to the heart and the mind of your participants, of your students, you have to show at least some little bit of a bridge, a hand reaching of building that relationship. So I definitely, that's just, you got to do it. Think of like your 1 minute elevator pitch that you can start to work on and refine. Perhaps use some healthy humor in that, whatever it is that kind of demonstrates who you are as a person. That will take you a long way, especially working with trauma sensitive youth.
Wow, ladies, this has been an amazing time. Thank you for everything that you shared with us. I think we're going to walk away with a lot of hope regarding our trauma-sensitive youth. And actually, that could probably apply to all the youth. I would refer you to the site registration page to get fuller bios of both Dr. Tanis and Dr. Huber. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you to our presenters, and most importantly, all of our participants today. We'll see you in a few short minutes for session 2. You're not going to want to miss this. Marianne Mozak is going to be engaging with the SRAE grantee panel. Talk soon.